I've been duped. Those are the sharp words of Rick Steves in his April 5 Huffington Post article. Palestinians suffer inhumane treatment that rarely makes the news. American taxpayers unwittingly subsidize Israel's brutal occupation. Rick, in his article, further recommended a video, his eye-opener, Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land. That video exposes the PR that deceives us all about Israel. Dr. Ibrahim Soudy joins me. We examine closely Rick Steves' awakening and the video, Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land. It is my pleasure to welcome returning guest to Moral Politics, Dr. Ibrahim Soudy. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. It's always nice to be with you.
Did Rick's article in the Huffington Post have real significance for the American public?
It's actually a very, very significant article because Rick Steves is a world-class traveler. He's a person who goes to places around the world and sees the facts as they are. And for a person like that to be fooled by the Zionist Jewish propaganda machine controlling the media in the United States has its very significant.
Well, let's take a look at that article, and we'll bring it up on the screen now for viewers, and you can see that he begins it with, "I've been duped." Obviously, there's some emotion, I think, connected to the start of this article.
Well, I think I can't imagine something that brings anger and outrage into any human being more than being betrayed and misled deliberately to believe in something that's actually completely opposite to the truth. And
in his article, you can see that he's saying the frustration you feel. He's definitely using some emotionally laden words and is reporting about this skew that he's now discovered. And he's discovered it by this powerful and courageous video, Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land.
The video or the documentary will never be shown on commercial television in America. The only way for people to see it is that they have to go to the internet and see it for themselves. I think Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land is a very powerful documentary. It teaches people quite a bit about the story and how much the story is being twisted in America here in order to make the public opinion of Americans totally supportive of the Israeli aggression. And
75 minutes invested, people can get some real eye-opening, like Rick, insight into the Mideast struggle, a very prolonged struggle. That might be one of the consequences, and one of the warnings that he's given us is that there's a cost to having this media skew, this media with an agenda.
Oh, of course, because America now is really disliked around the globe, and the main reason for that is, or one of the main reasons is that America takes the position of supporting Israel almost without any qualification, without any conditions.
You know, it looks to me like when he wrote this article, he's almost covering his bases a little bit, a little timid, very, very courageous, but a little timid when he says that something pretty obvious. He says that criticism of Israeli policies is not to be equated with criticism anti-Semitism.
The Zionist Jewish propaganda machine in America here has been very successful at using the correlation between criticism of Israel and being anti-Semite. And Robert Fisk in the documentary speaks to that quite a bit and very eloquently, actually.
The main major television news networks and newspapers in the United States have long ago got their fear to be supreme over their duties as journalists. They are not monitoring the centers of power when it comes to the relationship between America and the Middle East, Israel and America and the Arabs and the Palestinians. They will not ask the right questions. They will not report it using the correct words. They will not confront the reality, and they've given up. And I think once you acquire fear, it's very difficult to get rid of it.
There's something really critical here by not having these questions air about, is it a brutal occupation? And not being able to really review those questions. We can't have our government act responsibly.
The American media almost never refers to the Israeli takeover of Palestinian land as occupation. You never hear on the American media that actually Israel is occupying parts of Palestine against the will of Israel and the will of the Palestinian people, and actually against the international law itself.
The context that's often missing from the current reporting is that the Palestinian uprising is a revolt against a 34-year-long occupation. And if there's no occupation in the story, then the story doesn't really make sense, and the occupation is frequently missing.
Now, Rick Steves is a actually really well-known travel writer, travel guide, and host of public TV and public radio. He seems to have risked a lot to take this stance.
For anybody in America here to criticize Israel or to even mention facts that they do not want it to come out, that he will be targeted with the Zionist machinery here in America, and people lose their jobs if they talk about Israel. And Jon Stewart on his program, amazingly, one time he brought 3 Israeli politicians who said things criticizing Israel, and made a joke a little after that and said, obviously in Israel you can criticize Israel and still remain in office, a luxury which American politicians can never enjoy.
I think that's what Rick is getting at. Maybe he's alarmed and he recognizes that this is the one remaining taboo in America, is Israel.
I think when Americans learn more and more and then realize how much they have been lied to and how much they have been fooled. Yeah.
Do you think Rick is going to be targeted the way Jimmy Carter and Helen Thomas were?
I don't have any doubt that that will be the case. And there are already information out there that he is receiving quite a bit of hate emails and the threats and the stuff like that. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Zionist propaganda machine in America here and its agencies would try to pull him from public television and things like that, and even influencing his own business in terms of travels I think he will be subject to a huge smear campaign, which is typical of what they do with everybody else. If they have done it to Jimmy Carter, why do you think they will not do it to Rick Steves?
80% of Americans get most of their news from television, and it's very important that it be accurate.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict dominates American news coverage of international issues. Given that news coverage is Americans' main source of information on the conflict, it becomes important to examine the stories the news media are telling us and to ask the question, does the news coverage reflect the reality on the ground?
The television is still very powerful, although social media and internet and Facebook and stuff like that are really competing with television, but still television, people go home, the first thing they do is they turn the television on and then watch what they have. And with programs like Dancing with the Stars and things like that, television is very attractive still. So it is true, and not just that, but the Zionist, again, public relations machinery is controlling the biggest newspapers in America here, New York Times and Washington Post, and you get CNN, you get Robert Murdoch owning Fox News, and yeah, so it's very obvious, it's very clear. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Dancing with the Stars, so there's so much on TV, but then there's so much that's omitted from what we should be watching.
One of the things you have to keep in mind when you're looking at how media report on something like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not only understanding what's there in the story, but more importantly, what's not there, what's being left out.
It's amazing that you watch the BBC, for example, in Britain, and you see something about the same piece of news that's very different from what you see about the same issue here in America.
You look at the British press, the ways in which the Palestinian victims are dismissed and downplayed in the American media, the ways in which their deaths are justified in American coverage, becomes even more glaring. A really clear example of this is the BBC story on 6 Palestinian kids killed by an Israeli booby trap and one the next day by Israeli soldiers.
5 small bodies on their way to the grave, carried shoulder high, a martyr's funeral in Gaza for the dead schoolboys. Sources in the Israeli government and security services have admitted they were probably the victims of an Israeli booby trap.
If you looked at the American coverage from the same day, you'd struggle to think of it as even the same event. The report practically blames the victims for their own deaths.
In Gaza, a Palestinian teenager was killed in a clash with Israeli troops following the funerals of 5 boys. They died Thursday when one of them kicked an unexploded tank shell.
The message is filtered somehow. The media never mentions, for example, that Israel commits crimes on occupied land, but they always mention that Israel is retaliating. Israel is taking, as if poor Israel has nothing to do with the problem in the first place. Every aggressive action Israel takes against the Palestinians or against Lebanon or whatever it is always portrayed in America here as retaliation, as if it's the right thing to do. Israel has the right to defend itself. So commit whatever crimes you want, and then we have the right to defend ourselves.
And the context that is so missing is that occupation context that you just referred to.
Well, occupation actually is a very mild word. No. This is ethnic cleansing. This is Holocaust. What Israel is doing. In fact, I'm amazed by how much noise and talking the Jews make about the Holocaust and what happened to them. At the very time that they are doing a Holocaust of their own against the Palestinian people, and very cleverly hiding it from the American people.
The brutality just isn't really reported in American news, and so much excess force in that society, and so much of it takes place at the checkpoints where they divided up the society. That's a real cruelty. They have de-evolved the economy. They've put people on near starvation diets. They've given them no hope and no dignity.
In a way, ethnic cleansing and genocide and the Holocaust, whichever terminology you would like to. And not only that, but even recently, a protester was crossing a road in Israel, and the Israeli officer hit him with the machine gun in his face, just like that.
And even the government policy of breaking bones is rarely covered.
The one that is violating your rights and taking away your freedom is ruthless and uses systematic methods of violence to oppress you, like torture.
The Israeli settlers in the Palestinian land are always referred to them as Israeli settlers. They committed terrorism, but they are never referred to as Israeli terrorists in America.
You're referring to that alteration of language where settlement becomes a neighborhood.
CNN sent out a memorandum to its staff in the Middle East. In future, Gilo is to be called a neighborhood.
The Jewish neighborhood of Gilo on the outskirts of Jerusalem.
The Israeli neighborhood Gilo. Gilo, a Jewish neighborhood in East Jerusalem.
Now, there's a great deal of difference between a colony, which is what the settlement is, colon as the French say, and a neighborhood. A settlement, an Israeli settlement, is built for Jews and Jews only on Arab land, and it's illegal, against international law. A neighborhood is just a nice, friendly place.
This is southern Jerusalem, a quiet neighborhood.
When an Israeli dies in a suicide bombing or something like that, it's always portrayed in terms of how tragic that is, and so on and so forth, without ever referring to what are the actions behind somebody doing suicide bombing. And the documentary speaks to that quite a bit.
There was an important point brought out in the video piece, Propaganda in the Promised Land, how Arab deaths, Palestinian deaths, go underreported, undercounted, whereas Israeli deaths are always reported and sometimes exaggerated.
In the American media, on television, of course, but even in sophisticated media like the New York Times, Israelis, whether they're Israeli citizens or settlers or soldiers, are presented in a very humane, human way, a way in which Americans can identify with them.
23 Israeli soldiers were killed in the fighting. One of them was Mark and Rena Robinson's 21-year-old son, Matanya. His name means God's gift.
There's a saying in Hebrew, God gives and God takes, and he took him.
You have, for example, an Israeli soldier who's on Palestinian territory shooting Palestinians. If he gets, you go to his funeral, you see his grieving mother or wife or child. You learn about his name, his hopes, his dreams, where he came from, and so on. And yet you have, hundreds and thousands of Palestinians killed, and you never get to know their name. You never get to see a funeral. You're not exposed to the grief of the family. You don't know that these children, probably many of them were shot in their own homes, in their own backyards, or on the way to school.
You get to know the names of the Israelis who died. You get to know their dreams and their hopes. But when Arab die, it's either not reported at all or reported in a way as if it's due to their own actions in the first place. If they behave themselves, that wouldn't have happened to them.
Now, the video piece, Propaganda in the Promised Land, has this nice graphic on the mechanism, how the media works, all the layering and filtering.
The economic interests of media owners are shared by political elites, politicians and policymakers who form a second filter. A third filter, Israel's own public relations efforts, further affects the coverage. This institutional framework of American business and political interests in combination with Israeli public relations shapes media coverage of the Middle East. Finally, if any news stories critical of Israeli policy do surface, there are a host of media watchdog groups that monitor and pressure journalists and media outlets, the most important of which is CAMERA.
The message will somehow be twisted according to the views of the owners of the media itself, and that's very obvious on things like Fox News. And
but people probably weren't aware that it is so interwoven, that all in collusion there, and that there's even a watchdog element to this triumvirate that we just mentioned. It's mind-boggling. People aren't aware of how occupied ideologically American media, mainstream media.
It's just one arm of the whole machinery, if you will. And Haim Saban has said it very cleverly, that you need to promote your own agenda, you need to donate money to the politicians, you need to create a think tank, and then you need to have control over the media.
It's mentioned in the video, Peace, Propaganda in the Promised Land, that Israel is fighting a two-pronged conflict. There's the conflict with the Palestinians on the ground, but there's also that conflict in media space to control public opinion, to basically keep us uninformed and to keep us from holding our government responsible, because we might decide not to give Israel the billions and billions of dollars that it's getting, especially if we discover that it's carrying on a brutal occupation.
Influencing U.S. media coverage of the conflict is crucial. Controlling the images and words used to explain the conflict has become an important extension of the struggle.
Israel is really fighting a war on two fronts. The first is a military campaign being waged in the occupied territories against the Palestinian people. And the second is a PR campaign being waged here in the U.S. through the American media to ensure continued support for Israel's occupation. Alon Pincus, Consul General for Israel in New York and the coordinator of Israel's PR efforts, was recently quoted as saying, "We are currently in a conflict with the Palestinians, and engaging in a successful PR campaign is part of winning the conflict."
Well, if you want the politicians to do what you want them to do, you create an organization like AIPAC, which threatens any American politician. Unless they do what the Israel camp wants, they will be challenged in the election. And they have done that with former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney and with other people too. So you create AIPAC, and then on the other hand, you create this brainwashing machine that controls the public opinion. And then if you put these together, well, there is no politician in America who will have a future unless they do as AIPAC and the Zionist machinery wants them to do. So it's a very clever design. Add to that now the anti-Semitic threat against anybody who criticizes Israel or the Zionists in general. And you have now total control over the country, both as a people and as leadership. Total control. Yeah.
That's bleak. You've got me worried. But let me ask the question, why does Israel need to control media and public opinion?
For several reasons. Number one, you look at the amount of money that goes from America to Israel.
American aid to Israel totals over $6 billion per year. Israel receives $3 billion in direct aid, 2/3 of which is military aid intended for the purchase of American-made weapons. In addition, Israel receives $3 billion in indirect aid, at least half of which is used for military ventures, such as subsidizing Israel's domestic armaments industry. Not included in this figure are other forms of military aid, such as weapons given to Israel free of charge, including fighter planes and attack helicopters. Total U.S. aid to Israel since 1949 has amounted to over $100 billion, making Israel, a country the size of New Jersey, the fourth most powerful military in the world, in possession of the largest fleet of F-16 fighter planes outside the United States.
The official number is about $3 billion every year of military aid, but actually the real number is much bigger than that and is almost impossible to quantify. Why is that? Because there are so many non-profit organizations in America here that collect donations from many people, Jewish and non-Jewish, Christian Zionists, for example, and other people. And all that money actually gets tax deduction in America here is tax deductible, but that money gets siphoned to Israel from under the table. Well, to maximize that kind of donation and stuff like that, you need to control or fool the people and make them think that they are doing something good by donating money to Israel.
Now, we can agree that as Rick Steves discovered, peace, propaganda, and the Promised Land video is quite an eye-opener.
If it's strong enough to make somebody like Rick Steves realize how much he has been duped and bamboozled, like he uses the word in the column, like I say, I think any American would watch that documentary and would come to the same conclusion.
We can understand his outrage because being fooled, being deceived, is the #1 source for anger and outrage.
I'm not aware of any other thing that can make human beings more angry than being lied to and fooled, especially for that length of time.
You alluded to it, but media control. Now, we know we have a consolidated and we know we have a corporate, but is it safe, or can we honestly say that it's a Jewish mainstream media in America?
Given the small number of the Jewish people in America, and given how much influence they have in America, I think the phenomenon is very obvious. Yeah, you have less than 2% of the population, but they also own quite a bit of very powerful media outlets.
What if another ethnicity, we won't name any, but let's just say another ethnic group, had controlling influence over American media? Wouldn't that be a cause for outrage?
But given how successful the Jewish pro-Israel propaganda machine in America here, I think we have long ways to go before we can have a balanced approach.
Well, it was mentioned directly or indirectly in the video, Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land, an excellent video. that Israel remains perhaps the last taboo, a topic that you really can't deal with very well, but we need to deal with it. What's at stake?
Speaking the truth and talking in a correct way about Israel is not anti-Semitism. Israel is doing a great job of self-destruction, and if some Americans really like Israel, then they should advise it to really behave itself and do what is right. Yeah.
But we can agree that before Americans have its government sponsor policies and give money by the billions to another country, we should have some kind of reporting of what that country's nature really is. Is it conducting a brutal occupation?
The Jewish state, I'm sad to say, is conducting a Holocaust at the very time that it's using the Holocaust itself around the world to build the museums and to remind people with the tragedy that happened to the Jewish people. I think they should be really ashamed of themselves, and if they have learned anything from the Holocaust, then they should stop what they are doing to the Palestinian people.
So like Rick Steves, you want people to watch that video, and more than likely, they're going to sense that they've been fooled and they're going to have outrage. What should they do with that outrage?
Start talking correctly about the crime. If your conscience is weakening, then you start speaking up, and then you start talking to your politicians. You start writing responses to the articles and television programs that are brainwashing people about Israel. And America is an Israeli occupied territory, and if Americans want to really enjoy freedom, they should stop being an occupied territory by Israel.
Talk about how people can really show their support, even a salute for Rick Steves, and what can they do?
One thing is that they should send him emails, contact him in a way, and express support.
That's ricksteves.com, I believe.
You just Google Rick Steves, you will reach him. And then write to public television that they should maintain his program. And
he's a model. We can all awaken from this brilliant media deception that if it affects Rick Steves, it affects the majority of Americans. Dr. Ibrahim Soudy, I want to thank you again for appearing.
Thank you, Brad.